I'm going to call us to order here in just a second if folks want to find some seats. Thank you. Before I get into my formal remarks, just a brief announcement. For folks who have RSVP'd for the dinner, and so you would know if you're one of those people, once we're done with the lecture and the Q&A, we're going to ask you to please exit downstairs, the lower levels, and move upstairs till 6 p.m. But the galleries, our galleries are open. So if you want to stay in the building until the dinner, you can, and you can look in the galleries. If you've RSVP'd for dinner, you can pick up your name tags at about 5:30 and then come back downstairs at 6 o'clock when we'll start our reception. So that's my announcement. Get that out of the way, and then we'll move on to our talk here. So good afternoon. My name is Michael Crespin. I'm the director and curator of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. Welcome to the second day of the 2025 Julian J. Rothbaum Distinguished Lectureship on Representative Government. On behalf of the center and the Rothbaum family, I want to thank you for your attendance at this biannual event. We sponsor this lectureship to bring together scholars, students, and citizens to nurture the values of a representative democracy. Through our mission and in our center programs, we strive to strengthen representative democracy through engaged and informed citizens. The Rothbaum Lecture was established 42 years ago in 1983 with an endowment gift by Mr. Rothbaum's wife, Irene, and son, Joel Jankowski, who's with us today, along with his daughter. So welcome, thank you. This lecture series serves to promote ideals that Julian Rothbaum held dear in his own life and that the Carl Albert Center seeks to achieve in all its efforts today. He believed most strongly that this lectureship should underscore the importance of education, which enhances the quality of participation in public affairs, the cultivation of public service and future political leaders, and the broad-based engagement of private citizens in public affairs. In addition to a successful business career, Mr. Rothbaum made sure to give back to his state and country. He served 2 terms in the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma and another as an Oklahoma State Regent for higher education. He and his wife, Irene, endowed professorships in the College of Arts and Sciences, in the College of Fine Arts, and in the College of Law, and then in the Department of History. In addition, he established student awards in honor of his lifelong friend, Carl Albert, at 3 institutions of higher learning which Speaker Albert attended. Julian Rothbaum believed, as did his lifelong friend, Carl Albert, that education and public service are at the heart of a representative democracy. The center is proud to host its 22nd Rothbaum Lecturer, Professor Maggie Blackhawk. Professor Blackhawk teaches federal Indian law, constitutional law, and legislation at the NYU School of Law. Much of her scholarship explores the relationship between law and power, with an emphasis on ways subordinated peoples leverage law to shift power to their communities, especially outside of rights and courts-based frameworks. Her recent projects focus on the laws and legal histories of American colonialism and the central role of American Colonial Project, including the resistance and advocacy of Native and other colonized peoples in shaping the constitutional law and history of the United States. Professor Blackhawk was awarded the American Society for Legal Histories William Nelson Cromwell Article Prize, and her research has been published or is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Journal, Supreme Court Review, American Historical Review, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Journal of the Early Republic, and the Journal of Politics. In yesterday's lecture, Professor Blackhawk taught us that colonial administration was once a thriving academic field, but when political science turned its back on more recently. And this has had consequences for our understanding of both westward and global expansion. Today, we'll learn more about this important topic. At the end of the talk, we'll reserve some time for Q&A from the audience. I'll ask that you wait for a microphone to be brought to you before you ask your question. But now please help me welcome Professor Blackhawk for her second lecture, The Science of American Empire, Colonial Administration, and the Science of Government.
So thank you yet again to Professor Crespin, to the Carl Albert Center, to the Rothbaum and Jankowski family, and to you all for coming today. And for coming back, for those who have returned for yet another episode. It's a real honor to be here, and the hospitality I've received for the last 2 days has really been quite extraordinary. So thank you so much for that. Okay. So my second lecture today is on the science of American empire. Yesterday, we discussed expansion and American colonialism as being central to American political development, and in particular, the politics and structures of American government that we still live with today, despite the fact that our theories of representation have shifted to exclude those theories. So the puzzle that I outlined between Mill and Pitkin remains a puzzle that I hope to shed some more light on today. John Stuart Mill's On Representative Government described not only the need to govern savage peoples unilaterally or through the process of colonization, it advanced a theory of colonial governance rooted in administrative delegation. Far from articulating a novel or marginal view, Mill was writing within the well-established and rapidly professionalizing field of colonial administration. Published in 1861, his work followed that of Sir George Cornwall Lewis, whose 1841 essay on the government of dependencies sought not to invent, but to synthesize and codify prevailing theories. Study of colonial administration had long formed part of the broader study of government. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations included an extended chapter on colonial government, and treatises by Locke and Vattel similarly treated the government of colonies alongside their studies of the theory and law of governments generally. But the study of colonial government, in its own right, had well-established foundations of its own by 1841. For treatises and more theoretical works, the predominant methods were historical and comparative. Beginning with the imperial policy of ancient Greece and Rome, the studies then brought together and engaged with 17th century literatures on government, like Smith, and then moved on to survey the British government and her colonies at the time, as well as the colonies, policies, and the colonial policies and governments of the United States, the United Provinces, what would become the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden, and France. Well before Lewis's treatise, theorists like Baron Henry Brougham had produced comprehensive analysis, including his own multi-volume work titled An Inquiry into the Colonial Policy of European Powers. And these large-scale treatises built upon more specialized works that focused on particular forms of colonial administration. For example, a forum dated as early as 1700 published a compilation of essays that focused on the colonial administrative technology of, quote, the plantation. One such essay offered an early American reflection on colonization. In an essay titled The Benefit of Plantations or Colonies, published under another title in 1681, William Penn began with a hopeful, perhaps even aspirational reflection that, quote, colonies then are the seeds of nations, before going on to describe the benefits wrought by governing individuals under the plantation system. The science of colonial administration may have been new to North America in the latter half of the 19th century, but it had much deeper roots in Europe. By the early 1800s, many European powers had established specialized schools in colonial government, schools that you can see depicted on the slide. The first, established by the East India Company in 1803, was the College of Fort William in Calcutta. And that college was soon followed by its British counterpart, the East India College, or what was otherwise then known colloquially from its location as the College at Haileybury. By 1842, the Dutch had converted their Royal Academy at Delft into a mandatory training school for their own colonial administrators, requiring courses in language and regional studies. Like Britain, France initially developed its first colonial school abroad in 1874 in what was then known as Indochina, particularly in Saigon. Debates arose within the French Parliament as to whether the field of colonial administration demanded a separate school or whether the curriculum could be drawn collectively from the law faculty, the science college, and the Institute of Civilized Language. Advocates for a specialized college prevailed, and Saigon's college was later followed by others at home. France had smaller programs in colonial administrations at Sciences Po, for example, but these were closed with the opening of the l'École Coloniale in 1889, a school that later merged with the École Nationale d'Administration. Originally founded in the 1880s, what came to be called l'École Coloniale began as a school to educate Native people from the colonies and later focused on training colonial administrators. Notably, following the suspension of l'École Nationale d'Administration in 1848, only a year after it was founded, the l'École Coloniale Administrative Division served as the primary training school for all civil service officers until the ENA was reestablished in 1945 following World War II. Many of these schools, as well as the field of colonial administration, developed initially from a demand for colonial service training, similar to early efforts to craft the discipline of political science around the training of civil service members. Early visions of colonial administration often married the field with the practice of colonial government. Up until the 1880s, the major treatises on colonial administration were crafted by colonial administrators themselves. These were well-seasoned administrators who had served many years in colonial government across a range of jurisdictions. Debates over whether the field of colonial administration would require specialized schools or whether the field could be integrated into a range of disciplines within existing universities played out differently within the United States than it had in Europe. Rather than separating the field from the range of disciplines and focusing instruction on the training of civil administrative officials, public leaders and scholars in the US took the approach of integration, from history to political science to sociology. The disciplines were, in the latter half of the 19th century, in the midst of separating from each other, forging methods of scientific inquiry and attempting to distinguish themselves from forms of solely professional development, seeing themselves as academic disciplines with broader aims, more theoretical than practical. Like the disciplines of history, political science, and sociology at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, colonial administration was pressed beyond forms of practical application and became an area of scholarly inquiry for academics, another area to apply the scientific method. In their newly established graduate programs, universities across the country began to offer courses and even focused doctoral programs in colonial administration. Scholars who specialized in colonial administration taught classes and built programs at Harvard, where you can see the president of Harvard University, Lawrence Lowell. He had advocated for a separate colonial civil service school and had studied colonial education worldwide. He had wanted a separate program, but eventually the president to come after him established a program at Harvard nonetheless. Columbia as well formed its own program. Cornell, Yale, the University of Chicago, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of California. It was within these academic disciplines that the field of American colonial administration was born and flourished for decades from the latter half of the 19th century until the middle of the 20th. My lecture today will begin to draw the contours of the field of colonial administration within the United States, a field that formed a pillar of most American disciplines at their formation in the late 19th century and remained central to those fields until the middle of the 20th. Including history, sociology, and anthropology, as well as political science. I've spent the last 2 years building a library of monographs, treatises, unpublished dissertations, academic journals, articles, and essays from the field of colonial government and colonial administration. As one might imagine, most of this work is long out of print. And you can see some of it depicted on the slide. In undertaking this research, I've learned that many before me have aimed to build libraries that document the full breadth of scholarship on colonial administration. The largest collection I've found thus far has been the library of former Secretary of War, Elihu Root, depicted on the slide. He's also an NYU Law grad, which he eventually donated to the New York Public Library. My remarks today present preliminary findings from this broader library research. Given the audience and aim of these lectures, my remarks will focus particularly on the development of colonial administration as a field within the discipline of American political science. But it bears mention that there are related, albeit distinctive histories of colonial administration that could be traced within most modern disciplines. Moreover, although my remarks today single out the longue durée of political science, I should note at the outset that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to separate the trajectory of political science from the development of the academic discipline of history. For any of you who know the 19th century history of these fields, political science and history largely existed as a singular and overlapping discipline until the early 20th century. So just teasing these apart was also a fun project. Scholars before me, Robert Vitalis and Alasdair Roberts most notably, have excavated the relationship between colonial administration and the subfields of international relations and public administration, respectively. I'll build upon their work to excavate the influence of colonial administration upon the discipline of American political science writ large, with a particular emphasis on American politics and political theory, as well as the development of theories of representative government, administration, and the relationship between government, the Constitution, and law. So my lecture today will proceed in three parts. First, I'll chart the birth of the field of colonial administration within the discipline of American political science, describing their shared origins and the ways in which each were fundamentally shaped by the other. Second, I'll overview the field of colonial administration, what was studied, what methods were employed, and how the field developed over time, as a pillar within the discipline of political science, as well as in related fields like constitutional and administrative law that grew out of political science in its origins. Third, I'll excavate the use of the colonies and colonial governance as a testing ground for government experiment and ultimately refinement. These experimental and utopian projects were often founded upon a prevailing ideology that was wary of representative government, seeing representation as a hindrance to innovation, and idealized forms of scientific and technocratic government heavily reliant on administration and bureaucracy. The growth of this ideology combined with the science of colonial administration, fostering a foundational relationship between colonial administration and public administration, fields often led by the same scholars. Finally, I'll close part three with the ways that Gilded and Progressive era leaders and thinkers closed the gap between colonial and public administration with the development of large-scale administrative government domestically within the United States, and with the development of theories of constitutionalism, administration, and law that would shield these forms of administrative innovation from those limits that the innovators found stifling, particularly constitutional limit, judicial review, and representative government. Let's begin with the origins. Before the first School of Political Science and U.S. graduate program in political science formed at Columbia University in 1880, what would become the discipline of American political science was thought of as an aspect of the newly established science of history. Francis Lieber, the first professor of politics at Columbia, whom Burgess was hired to replace, taught both history and government. But John William Burgess thought he knew better. Like Lieber, Burgess had been appointed professor of political science and history at Amherst College before his appointment at Columbia. Burgess, however, believed that new science of politics demanded its own field of inquiry, even its own department, which you can see here depicted in 1880. A department not solely focused on training future civil servants, but also one that would offer depth and method to the study of American government and its maturing institutions. From 1880 until 1890, Burgess's effort to build an independent field of political science flourished. He grew his faculty at Columbia threefold, hiring two of his former students, Monroe Smith, who is on the left, and Frank Goodnow, into faculty positions within the school. Smith to teach Roman administrative law and the history of European law, and Goodnow to teach U.S. administrative law. He was the first professor to do so. Burgess and Smith then co-founded the first U.S. Journal of Political Science, the Political Science Quarterly in 1886, and crafted essays that began to articulate the nascent field. In 1890, Burgess became the first dean of the Faculty of Political Science, and he published a monumental 2-volume work, Political Science and Comparative Constitutional Law, to serve as both introduction and a survey textbook for the nascent field. In many ways, the discipline of American political science and the field of colonial administration were born alongside one another in the United States. In fact, very much like the origin story of colonial administration, American political science also struggled initially to establish itself as something more than an effort to train political leaders and civil servants. Graduate training in any discipline in the US was undeveloped prior to the Civil War. As a consequence, founders of what would become the discipline of political science took great care to establish their department as an academic discipline, rooted in historical and comparative methodologies, and as a source of broad theoretical insights. Many of these founders, John William Burgess among them, were trained not in the underdeveloped doctoral programs of the United States, but in 19th century German doctoral seminary systems. And they embraced that form of doctoral training as a means to develop both the institution of the university as well as to shape their disciplines. Described today as the father of American political science, John William Burgess published his first manuscript in 1890. It was a 2-volume work titled Political Science and Comparative Constitutional Law. Through his nearly 700-page magnum opus, Burgess hoped to give birth to the academic discipline of political science, centering the field as a study of empirical and theoretical study of nations, or, quote, a population of ethnic unity inhabiting a territory of geographic unity, as well as the study of the systems of government or states that these nations implemented. So he saw these two units as different. The nation was something that then formed the state or the government. Burgess went on to center forms of colonial government and administration as a central concern for nations, and thus for the discipline, describing one of the responsibilities of nations, and of the United States in particular, as to carry the political civilization of the modern world into those parts of the world inhabited by unpolitical and barbaric races. That is, he stated frankly, the United States, like all other nations, quote, must have a colonial policy. By colonial policy, Burgess meant that the United States, along with other, quote, civilized nations, would need to establish formal process whereby the US would force organization upon so-called uncivilized peoples by any means necessary. If these peoples, quote, cannot accomplish their own civilization, they must submit to the powers that cannot do it for them, that can do it for them. Further, should these uncivilized peoples resist the efforts of the United States to govern them towards civilization, Burgess described, the US was then justified to, quote, clear the territory of their presence and make it the abode of civilized man. More than an ancillary aspect of the new discipline of political science, governing others toward forms of so-called civilization shaped the central frame of Burgess's new discipline in subtle ways. Burgess's main focus on page 1 of 700 was a unit of analysis called a, quote, nation, a term he described as derived from the Latin nascere, meaning to be born or to spring forth. Burgess envisioned nations as springing forth from a shared unity of language, religion, and culture, a process of nationalism that was importantly unifying, even in the absence of a homogeneous or even shared form of government. This was a definition of a people. Nations, to Burgess, existed independently from and even preceded those forms of government that a nation might construct. It was a concept likely influenced by Burgess's experience witnessing the German process of nationalization firsthand. This process, undertaken to form a singular German nation under the Prussian Empire, ended in 1871, the year Burgess arrived in Germany for his doctoral training. Just 10 years after the end of the bloodiest domestic war in North American history, and amidst an ongoing and violent territorial expansion that had left the United States as a patchwork of territorial, military, Indian state, and other contested jurisdictions, many were seeking ways to unify the country under a singular vision of itself. Burgess offered the idea of the nation as a means to both define the United States, with its contested borders and patchwork of jurisdictions, as a singular, fundamental, and even natural unit of political organization, sharing language, culture, and religion, and to justify further unification out of disparate peoples, lands, and governments. Burgess's definition of nation, drawn explicitly from the narrow German usage, included within itself the process and argument for national unification in the first instance. Like the Prussian Empire a few short years before, the idea of nation might bring together a fractured and fragmented United States under a shared political designation, as well as provide future academics with a presumed singular unit of analysis for comparative and theoretical work. So central to the idea of nation was unification that Burgess began his fourth chapter, after defining nation in the first three, with a declaration that, quote, national unity is the determining force in the development of the modern constitutional states. The prime policy, therefore, Burgess observed, of each of these states should be to attain proper physical boundaries, so to actually set its boundaries, and to render its population ethnically homogeneous. Thus, the United States was not a patchwork of disparate governments and peoples. According to Burgess's Science of Politics, it was already a nation. And nations must unify. They must combine states or expand through annexation or absorption of geographies to ensure those proper physical boundaries and ensure ethnic homogeneity. As central to Burgess's idea of nation was a linguistic, religious, and cultural unity. And as central to that was the idea of disunity. Given the need of nations to unify, establish stable borders, and foster homogeneity within their populations, nations would also need to have standards by which lands might be annexed, by which disparate peoples might be brought under unified and homogeneous institutions of government and legal frameworks, by which the migration of foreign peoples might be controlled and limited, and by which civilized nations might govern others through force toward linguistic, religious, and cultural uniformity. And so colonial government and administration formed a necessary counterpart to the formation and unification of a nation. As mirror images, one could not exist without another. So by the time Burgess published this text, his first manuscript, he was far along on his path of establishing what would become the modern discipline of American political science. Having succeeded Francis Lieber as professor of history and political science at Columbia University, he founded their first department of political science in the country, and thus its first graduate training program upon his arrival to Morningside Heights in 1880. This manuscript, Political Science and Comparative Constitutional Law, formed part of a wave of efforts by Columbia political science faculty to craft a canon and central textbook for political science courses as the discipline grew over the decade that followed, reaching full professionalization with the founding of the American Political Science Association in 1803. Burgess's commitment to centering colonial administration within the field of political science wasn't simply theoretical or aspirational. He quickly began to build out the curriculum on the subject within his newly founded department. In 1884, Burgess supported the appointment of his recent student, Frank Johnson Goodnow, to the Faculty of Political Science. Goodnow, known today as one of the principal founders of the American Political Science Association, as well as its first president, and one of the foremost scholars on administrative law and administration, prepared courses on, quote, the history and principles of colonial administration, and drafted an unpublished manuscript on the subject during his many years on the Columbia faculty. The study of colonial administration spread even faster than Burgess's efforts to establish the field of political science as a distinctive area of study. Other distinguished universities were more hesitant. At Harvard, for instance, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences continued to subsume the study of government and politics under the single header of history until 1892, when they established the more inclusive but far less celebratory Department of History and Political Science. Harvard University began offering graduate courses and even areas of emphasis for graduate study specific to colonial administration through their combined history and government department, years before they established an independent department of government in 1912. By the early 20th century, nearly every prominent university within the United States, all depicted on the slide, had hired a specialist in colonial administration and offered training in the field. Of the 14 original founding universities of the American Association of Universities, all 14 hired professors with specializations in colonial administration and offered curriculum in the field. Beyond Columbia and Harvard, Cornell, Yale, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, as well as the universities of California, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Chicago, and Michigan, all offered courses and specialization in the field of colonial administration. These universities each hired at least one faculty member with documented expertise in the field, and some, like Harvard, hired a range of specialists across the disciplines of history, political science, and law. And they developed programs to train students to specialize in the study of colonial administration. And you can see here these names. Some of them may seem familiar to areas of study that you focus on. Some of them may not, but you can see from the top of the slide to the bottom how each of these universities not only hired specialists in these areas, but they often moved between universities, and some of them, like Harvard, Columbia, the University of California, University of Wisconsin, they hired numerous faculty members and collectively built programs around colonial administration. As the discipline of political science, like other academic disciplines within the American Academy, began to separate and establish independent fields of inquiry in the first years of the 20th century, colonial administration remained at the center of the discipline. At the announcement of the newly formed independent American academic disciplines at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, officially known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, just to bring some lecture in from yesterday, Chancellor E. Benjamin Andrews of the University of Nebraska and Professor William A. Dunning of Columbia University, infamous, introduced the, quote, 5 pillars of the burgeoning discipline of political science, political theory, diplomacy, national administration, municipal administration, and colonial administration, or the science of governing others towards civilization. Presenting on the pillar of colonial administration was Professor Harry P. Judson, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, soon to serve as the president of the university, and Professor Bernard Moses of the University of California, where he founded the Department of History and Political Science in 1883 and the standalone Department of Political Science in 1903. Similarly, colonial administration remains central as the discipline of American political science professionalized. Frank Goodnow was a principal founder of the American Political Science Association, formed in 1903 and served as its first president. Both he and first APSA vice president, Paul Reinsch, on the right side of the slide, specialized in the science of colonialism. Goodnow, Burgess's colleague at Columbia and his former student, Paul Reinsch was a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin, as well as the colleague and former student of the famed father of the frontier thesis, Frederick Jackson Turner, who argued that the experience of settlers colonizing the frontier and in descending from British colonial civilization to savagery and back again had given birth to the true character of America. Reinsch published his second and third books, titled Colonial Government and Colonial Administration, in 1902 and 1912, respectively. So before surveying what became the field of colonial administration and its influence upon the discipline of political science writ large, I wanted to briefly address a likely looming puzzle over periodization. As many know, to the extent that American colonialism is studied comprehensively at all in the academy, it's generally periodized as beginning in the late 19th century, generally at the end of the Spanish-American War, and as reaching its peak around the turn of the century, before it's seen as dying out shortly thereafter. We can call that the William Appleman Williams view for those who have a familiarity with diplomatic history. The so-called Age of Empire within the United States is the very same period during which the disciplines professionalized. Hence, the puzzle is whether the relationship between the American academic disciplines, including political science and the field of colonial administration, is sheer coincidence, correlation without causation, So I would argue that this puzzle suffers from areas of periodization on both sides. As I've shown, periodization of American empire didn't exist only for a few years at the turn of the 20th century. So that periodization, treating it as distinctive and as a separate form of colonial policy and administration, is simply not borne out by the historical record. Rather, American colonial government and administration originated over 100 years earlier with the governing, legal, and ultimately constitutional framework of the Northwest Ordinance. And although this blueprint was refined and reformed for a range of new circumstances, it largely remained the same. So I am more Lefebvre than I am William Appleman Williams. American colonial government and policy also did not shift radically into the 20th century. Although the US was responsive to global shifts in the politics and perspectives on colonialism and colonial government, these shifts often came much later, following each world war, and not in the first few years of the 20th century. This puzzle also suffers from the problematic periodization with respect to the field of American colonial administration. So not only was that field built upon decades of development of colonial administration globally, it was also born into the American Academy much earlier, not necessarily as a separate area of inquiry and specialization that would justify the establishment of separate schools, but as a pillar that branched out from a range of academic disciplines as they were formed as distinctive lines of inquiry in the late 19th century. Moving on to the science. In essence, efforts to study colonial government, its forms, aims, and theories with scientific rigor were born of disappointment within the United States. Especially dissatisfied with the results of the US colonial policy to date, the founders of the field of American colonial administration sought to establish the field with methods of scientific inquiry at its core, while simultaneously breaking with the colonial administrative policy of the US from the 1880s onward. Early scholars of colonial administration decried the colonial policy governing Native peoples, which was at the time the paradigmatic case of American colonialism. Native peoples had failed to assimilate or even obtain forms of civilization and eventually had to be exterminated, a costly and morally fraught process. From the perspective of a newfound science of colonial government, they aimed toward building nations through civilization. This history provided only examples of failure. Moreover, future populations might not be so easily removed. The US needed a broader field upon which to build its study of colonial government than the Indian affairs of the nascent and developing nation. Although initially hesitant to look toward other European nations as models, comparative study often offered the few rare examples of successful colonial government. As Professor Paul Reinsch, soon to be founding vice president of the APSA, described in his first 1902 book on the subject, titled Colonial Government, public discourse often approached the, quote, American experiment as too exceptional to look to other nations for guidance on policy, including in respect to the government of dependencies. Yet Reinsch surmised the questions faced by the field of colonial administration moving forward could not necessarily be answered by the established US practice to date, because the government now sought to administer the colonization of populations who, quote, cannot be swept away before the advancing tide of Caucasian immigration, as were the North American Indians, such that it's therefore not safe to apply these precedents without careful selection. The initial methods they chose to study and ultimately reshape US colonial administration were one, historical, including a deep dive into the history of colonial administration in the United States itself, and two, broad comparative case studies with other forms of colonial administration as implemented by so-called civilized nations. So comparative study largely focused on the imperial government as the organizing unit, or less commonly, they may study colonial government colony by colony, but that was less common. Histories of colonial administration within the United States and worldwide focused on the legal histories of expansion, management of the public domain, and the regulation of territories. Max Ferrand, who would later compile the famed records of the Federal Constitutional Convention of 1787, compiled in 1896 a statutory history of all legislation passed by Congress to govern the territories of the United States from 1789 to 1895. they understood these legal frameworks as coherent. In 1903, the Treasury Department and Bureau of Statistics, along with bibliographical support from the Library of Congress, compiled what you see here is a nearly 500-page comparative study of colonial administration for the period of 1800 to 1900. Subtitled Methods of Government and Development Adopted by the Principal Colonizing Nations in Their Control of Tropical and Other Colonies and Dependencies, with statistical statements of the area, population, commerce, revenue, etc., of each of the world's colonies. The treatise, like many, built a massive bibliography also of colonial administration literature and scholarship, from theory to expansion to forms of colonial administration analyzed in case studies by imperial government. From these early studies, as well as the synthesis of long-standing bodies of literature worldwide, scholars quickly began to uncover distinctive principles of government in the colonial context, distinctive motivations for those governments in their form, and distinctive central questions for the study of these governments. So here you have 6 great questions regarding the methods of governing and developing tropical colonies and their peoples. Most of them ask about the relationship between the colonizing government and the colony, as well as forms of self-determination and measures of development. So central questions over colonial government generally focus first on the theory and justification for colonization, both in terms of principles that would guide the seizure and formation of a colony, as well as the practices required to establish those colonies and the principles that would guide governing the people of that colony over time. Establishing colonies required understanding how to govern and guide the movement of populations and what principles would govern the expansion of territory. Studies of expansion stretch the boundaries of how to study government at all. Rather than focusing on centralized and stable institutions and borders, the field of colonial government focused on missionaries, exploration, and the dynamic flows of capitalism. Even when scholars of colonial government focused on governing institutions, they quickly found them distinctive in the colonial context. And so the field started to center around these 3 areas. Again, trying to theorize them as both related but separate areas of inquiry. And we can almost see them as relating to areas of the study of government today. So those principles guiding colonization, we think of them today as constitutional principles, foundational values that drive the formation of government. We think of that as liberty, consent of the governed. But here, the questions surrounded civilization, the relationship between the colony and the colonizing government, often termed as federalism, as well as the institutions of government that they studied, specifically in the colonial context. Scholars began to document and build a typography of relationships between the colony and the colonizing government, placing this typography on a spectrum of most intervention or management by the colonizing government in the colony to the least. And so you can see the spectrum into direct administration in the center. Protectorates at the top, so least forms of intervention, also known as dependencies, were countries that were governed or protected by another government in any form. So protection could involve coming to the protectorate's aid to protect from invasion, for example, or it could involve greater forms of oversight and intervention. Chartered companies extended the authority of a corporate entity over a jurisdiction. The East India Company, of course, was the paradigmatic example of this. Direct administration of a colony, by contrast, involved the greatest level of intervention into that colony's government, as well as more effort and infrastructure on the part of the colonizing government. Direct administration could also offer greater and lesser forms of self-determination for the colony. So these measures largely turned on which government controlled the officers of the colonial government and which government made law for the colony. And you can see on the right side of the slide the different measures and who could control what. And they saw these typologies as different ways to slot power over the officers and law made within the colony. So less self-determination meant that the colonizing government controlled colonial officers and made law for the colony. More self-determination meant that the colony was afforded the ability to control those administrative officers, maybe elect their own colonial governor, for example, or make law for the colony. And of course, this law was always subject to the veto power of the colonizing government. Beyond direct administration were colonies that self-governed without direct oversight. More often, the stated goal of colonization was to support or civilize colonies towards these forms of self-government. And so self-governing colonies were likely colonies moving toward independence, so much like the Commonwealth status afforded the Philippines and former British colonies. But this would allow them to maintain a relationship with the colonizing government until they moved towards full independence. So you can see a bit of a temporal aspect towards the bottom. And finally, colonies could form a federation or collection of colonies that would collectively organize and govern. Scholars of colonial administration also understood that government within the context of colonies demanded a range of governing institutions, and these were often spread more diffusely over separate forms of geography, and they were not seen in purely representative governing terms. These included oversight institutions like colonial commissions that brought government from the metropole to the colony. Colonies also needed structuring principles for their governments, borders, membership, and other areas of fundamental public law. So those legal frameworks are often thought of as constitutional law, the constitutive principles and rules of a people and a government and the state that they build collectively. But in the colonial context, these laws are most often supplied by the colonizing government rather than arising from the people themselves. The government of the colony, national, local, and municipal, may feel familiar at first blush, but the national government of a colony often consisted solely of administrators and administration. A colonial governor sat atop a government by commission and council. Then came the law of the colony, which consists often of an amalgam of law made by colonial governments and customary law. So colonizing governments simply couldn't just move into a region and shift property ownership, family structures, and even traditional governance overnight. So the recognition and adoption of legal frameworks that were already in existence was actually quite common and even a necessary feature of colonial government. And finally, scholars of colonial administration understood that colonial courts were entities that always operated almost independently of that colonial government. These courts could be staffed with people from the colony or by jurists from the colonizing government. And through these institutions, laws could be imposed or recognized and adopted from the colonized community. But importantly, these courts were held as separate from the primary colonial government by administration. They were seen as distinctive. Relatedly, colonial government also required greater and more complex forms of power distribution than a standard federal system. Rather than simply studying the relationship between federal and state systems, for example, which is what we see in the US, study of colonial government often required a trifurcated study of governing institutions. So the top layer of governing institutions was the colonizing government, primarily European empires like France, Great Britain, Holland, or Spain, but also the United States, including a mixture of its state and federal governments, its own constitutions. Just imagine our system then smashed into just the top layer. The middle layer includes an intermediary government between the colonizing government and its colonies. So these institutions could be centralized or distributed, uniform, or varied. But this layer of government defined the relationship between the colonizing government and the colony. That is, was the colony a dependency or a protectorate, or was it something that was held more closely, for example? Was it governed as an enclave? The third and often varied set of governing institutions governed the colony directly. So they could be oversight through the colonizing government, actually using their legislature or executive, or indirectly through some form of delegated administrative government or a chartered corporation. Colonial federalism was also separated, importantly, geographically, and it governed populations that were often distinct, very distinct, linguistically, religiously, culturally, and legally. Because of these differences, there often existed even a fourth layer of government that preserved traditional or pre-colonial governing and legal institutions. It was usually an informal system. These more complex understandings of federalism mapped on in interesting ways to the structures of government that we see in Indian country today. So this is our colonial federalism, and it actually fits within the colonial administration theoretical literature. You can see the United States, the metropole, with all of its federalism and constitutional government at the top, with federal Indian law, the law of the United States, structuring the relationship between Native nations and the United States. Largely, that's the Indian Reorganization Act, but also treaties, regulations, and other statutes. Then at the bottom, you have the tribal government and tribal law and its tribal constitution. They also bear a resemblance to the governing structures of the island territories that we see today. It's slightly different. So you have the United States government at the top, and then including territorial law, which forces or intervenes all of US national or federal law across the territories without their consent. They can't actually pass their own form of national law. It's all local or municipal, and many of our island colonies are actually not afforded the self-determination measures of drafting their own constitution. So US federal law still structures their own territorial government. Because government by administration rather than representation dominated colonial policy, the field quickly turned to focus on colonial administration as a primary area of analysis and inquiry. Aside from the omission of public health, the categories of colonial administration might likely appear to be familiar categories for administrative government generally. So labor, agriculture, commerce. But there were some important distinctions. So colonial governments were notoriously expensive to administer, as Adam Smith over 100 years earlier in his Wealth of Nations had noted. And this was all the more true when colonial governments governed directly and with greater force. Military occupation and government via martial law was expensive, difficult to maintain, and often required abhorrent forms of violence. As a consequence, one of the central and enduring questions of colonial administration was how to finance the colonial government through either resource extraction and trade monopolies, as well as complex forms of taxation, usually focused on property and property taxes, as well as measures to reduce costs and moral burdens by offering those colonies forms of self-determination, lessening the governing responsibility of the colonizing government. So colonies as laboratories of government. Within a few years of the founding of the discipline of American political science, the distance between the fields of colonial administration and that of domestic or public administration began to close. Scholars studying administrative government and administrative law moved smoothly between the study of administration within colonized and non-colonized jurisdictions, grounding unified theories of administrative government on both. European nations had long understood their colonies as laboratories for forms of government and social control. Colonial administration abroad similarly became a testing ground for innovations in administrative government within the domestic United States. The colonies freed scientists of government from the demands of representation, the tumult of politics, and the constraints of the Constitution, to allow experimentation and innovation in governance driven by the newly developed forms of empiricism. Scholars and government leaders alike became ever more committed to the idea that the problems of civilization and modernity could be as readily resolved through scientific government and technocratic administration as problems of savagery. At Columbia, Burgess's student and protege Frank Goodnow laid the groundwork for the modern field of administrative law, arguing that the future of effective governance lay in administration, not legislation, and in bureaucracies, not elected assemblies. For both, the colonies offered a kind of administrative blank slate, territories where government could be implemented without the inefficiencies of democratic accountability. These spaces allowed statecraft to be perfected through experimentation, insulated from popular sovereignty and judicial review. Goodnow, in particular, articulated a vision of administrative law and political science that imagined administrators as apolitical experts, whose work should be structured separately from the will of the people. In building the field of administration and administrative law, Goodnow and others were quick to distinguish the field from constitutional law and from the Constitution, an area of law where the Supreme Court could intervene. Legal limitations on administration would arise and be reinforced from the bureaucracy itself. Professional officers, limited by their own disciplinary training as well as their oaths, would be checked from within the bureaucracy rather than without. As was true also within the colonies, Goodnow differentiated administration from politics. Administrators should be checked by the political process if they overstep their role within the separation of powers, but the act of administration should be nonpartisan, neutral, and driven by science and not by politics. These scholars went on to directly train and shape the thinking of many early 20th century public officials, including Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, both of them young, but depicted on the slide, and both of whom came to embrace the idealized model of technocratic, centralized administration. Under their leadership, as well as the leadership of other colonial administrators like William Howard Taft, a new generation of progressive reformers rose to power, carrying forward the belief that scientific management, not representative government, was the key to modern governance. Their vision was clear. The problems of the modern world, urbanization, industrial labor, immigration, and even colonial rebellion, were best solved not through legislation and courts, but through the rational design and deployment of administrative systems, guided by trained experts. This progressive ideal of administrative government would take hold not just in Washington and state capitals, but in city halls, universities, and colonial outposts alike. In 1910, the University of Michigan founded their Department of Political Science and successfully coaxed Professor Jesse Siddell Reeves, then teaching at Dartmouth, to chair and lead the newly established department. Reeves was a scholar of colonial administration, having studied westward expansion, particularly the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and what he called, quote, boundary problems that arose from the annexation and occupation of Texas and Oregon, and acquisitions following the Mexican-American War. Reeves quickly hired his then student into the department, Joseph Ralston Hayden, and he is on the right. He was writing his dissertation on the development of the treaty power in the Senate from the founding until 1817, focused on treaties with Native nations, the Louisiana Territory, and the genesis of the Committee on Foreign Relations. Professor Hayden soon connected with Frank Murphy, son of Irish Catholic immigrants and student at the University of Michigan as an undergraduate and then as a law student. Murphy trained under scholars of colonial administration and administrative law, including Professor Hayden, at Michigan before completing graduate training in Ireland after the World War, where he studied colonial administration from a different perspective amidst the Irish movement for independence from Britain. Frank Murphy's career, later commemorated on his tombstone, was as distinguished as it was diverse. We all want to have a resume such that we can carve it into stone. After a brief tenure practicing law and serving as a judge in Detroit, he was elected mayor of the city. His trajectory then extended beyond domestic governance, where he held administrative roles in the Philippines, before returning to serve in the national government. In 1940, he was appointed an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. At first glance, Murphy's resume appears singular enough to merit literal inscription in stone. Yet his movement between municipal leadership, colonial administration, and federal service was not as anomalous as it might seem. Among progressive era officials, it was actually relatively common to build careers that straddled both domestic and colonial spheres, cutting their administrative teeth in city halls and territorial governments alike. In 1930, during the height of the Great Depression, Murphy successfully ran for mayor of Detroit, promising the city its own, quote, little New Deal. Murphy brought his belief in the power of technocratic government, along with his expertise in colonial administration, to his position as mayor. Professor Hayden, on the far right, a Republican, wrote at the time that although he remained skeptical of the Democratic Party in Michigan, he had faith in Murphy, who he believed would appoint strong, honest, capable men of both parties. Murphy's stated goal was to appoint the best possible non-political administration, one that would work to support the Lansing New Deal. Academics from the University of Michigan, like Hayden himself, played a prominent role in Murphy's administration. Michigan even became a brain trust of sorts, facilitated by Murphy's former professor. Following Murphy's second term as mayor, former student of Frank Goodnow and fellow expert in colonial administration, Frank Delano Roosevelt, appointed Murphy as Governor General of the Philippines, an appointment that raised more than a few questions because Murphy held little to no expertise in the Philippine Islands. Again, Murphy brought his belief in technocratic administrative government to the island colony, as well as his recent experience implementing New Deal programs at the city level in Detroit. Murphy also brought his former professor, who had developed a research agenda on the Philippines, convincing FDR to appoint him as Vice Governor General. You can actually see him here on the slide, and we can have sort of a Where's Waldo for the next two pictures, because he keeps showing up in all of Murphy's appointments. Throughout his appointment, Murphy began to marry ideas of progressive constitutionalism, including administration and self-determination. Drawing upon his own Irish Catholic heritage and his studies in Dublin, where he'd engaged with both colonial administrators and independence movement leaders, Murphy quickly positioned himself as an anti-imperialist. In early speeches, he linked the Philippines' path to self-determination with Ireland's recent independence. His plan for the Philippines, which historians now call the Philippine Little New Deal, merged these two visions. A functional economy that met basic needs, he believed, was necessary for self-determination. And an efficient, expert-driven bureaucracy was the means to create that economy. New Deal-style administration of American colonies was thus the essential and final step to achieving self-government and eventually independence. Murphy and Hayden soon brought to the Philippines an outward symbol of the New Deal, outlining programs in almost every field of humanitarian activity, including public health, institutional care, child and family welfare, recreation, crime and corrections, unemployment assistance, improved housing, and rural development. Murphy was able to increase appropriations for these programs 15-fold, and he implemented them through a bureaucracy similar to the one in Detroit that was staffed with technocratic and importantly, Filipino administrators. The Moro region of the Philippines had long been a site of American experimentation in government, experiments that most often ended in failure. Under then Civil Governor William Howard Taft, the Moro region had been placed under a similar administrative apparatus to Indian country, with reservations, colonial agents, and boarding schools. Scholars back in the US even argued that Moros could be considered, quote, Indians for purposes of US constitutional law, rendering them ineligible for constitutional birthright citizenship. Shortly after the end of Taft's term as governor, these structures of government failed. Federal agents and military officials undertook one of the largest and most brutal massacres of modern history, slaughtering nearly 1,000 Moro men, women, and children, echoing many of the slaughters and massacres of the American West. Murphy and Hayden promised the Moros a New Deal of their own, with particular support for administrative institutions and social welfare programs that reflected the religious and cultural perspective of the region at the local level, if they would submit to the authority of the Philippine government as a national power. Alongside their plans for a Philippine New Deal, Murphy and Hayden had pressed forward the Tidings-McDuffie Act that would become the 10-year plan for Philippine independence, following a period of US oversight of the Philippine government as a commonwealth. But they first needed to stabilize and unify the government of the islands. Murphy served as the last Governor General of the Philippines, and after serving a year as High Commissioner, that advisory position that was created by the Tidings-McDuffie Act, he returned to the States and to his home state of Michigan, where he successfully ran against the incumbent Republican governor and won. Murphy moved seamlessly between administrations, bringing to Michigan the same growth and social welfare programs he had promised to the Philippines. He implemented those same programs around general relief, old age assistance, aid to the blind, rural development, and more. Despite his success as governor, Murphy lost his reelection campaign, and after a brief stint as attorney general, FDR appointed him to the Supreme Court, where he would spend the next 9 years bringing his perspective on good government and administration to a range of constitutional and administrative law cases. Today, Frank is celebrated as a mayor, a governor general and high commissioner, and as a justice. The president of the Philippines flew the flags of the then independent country at half-mast upon Murphy's death in 1949. The field of colonial administration would continue on past the Second World War, although its relationship to the problems of empire globally would soon come to the fore. Earl Pomeroy, one of the fathers of the field of Western history and student of the scholar of colonial administration, Frederick Paxson at Berkeley, published a history of the American Colonial Office in 1944, documenting the troubles that had arisen from its lack of establishment, and seemingly also alluding to the ongoing need to establish this centralized office. In his article, Pomeroy clarifies, constitutionally, there is no essential difference between the territories and colonies, noting also the comments of founding father James Monroe, as he served on the Congressional Committee on Temporary Government for New States, when he similarly referred to these governments as colonies. But over time, over the course of the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the field of colonial administration begins to vanish from all American disciplines, not with a decisive break, but with a quiet and near total disappearance. One way to trace this vanishing act is through its evolution in the context of Indian affairs, where the tools and language of colonial administration were long embedded. As late as 1928, the field still held significant influence. The Merriam Report, formerly titled The Problem of Indian Administration, applied the theories and frameworks of colonial government to native populations within the United States. It treated Indian country as a domestic colony, recommending an array of administrative reforms aimed at managing native peoples' adjustment to the political, legal, and constitutional culture of the US empire. By 1945, Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier was explicitly promoting the advancements made in Indian administration as a model for the post-war world, a kind of laboratory of ethnic relations that could be replicated globally. His vision extended beyond indigenous policy. Collier oversaw the construction of Japanese American incarceration camps during World War II, including the first 2 on Indian reservations. He even proposed that these camps serve as training grounds for future colonial administrators who would be deployed in the post-war order. Yet by 1946, Collier's colleague and fellow official in the Indian Service and War Relocation Authority, Solon T. Kimball, would diagnose a, quote, crisis in colonial administration. That crisis, he argued, emerged in the wake of global uprising against colonial rule, especially in territories where European powers had withdrawn during World War II occupation and that it attempted to reassert control afterward as if nothing had changed. Rather than provoking a deeper reckoning with the political, ethical, or structural challenges of empire, this crisis gave way to something more subtle but more enduring: erasure. In the years that followed, the study of colonial governance receded from view. Political science, sociology, anthropology, and history turned their attention elsewhere, toward modernization theory, development, civil rights, and liberal constitutionalism, disavowing the imperial foundations upon which so many of their assumptions had been built. And yet, as we've seen, scholars of colonial administration did more than just bridge domestic and imperial governance. They helped to construct a technocratic vision of state power that profoundly shaped both. So as the field of colonial administration faded from academic and political memory, we're left with a difficult question. When the tools of empire are no longer called imperial, do they truly disappear? Or do they merely find new names, new frontiers, and new populations to govern? I'll end my remarks there today, but thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And there will be a microphone coming around. There's a hand up in the front, I think, if you don't mind. Thank you. Sorry, right in the middle.
You reference Indian country and you make it sound like it's a colony. But could you be a bit more specific about what you think Indian country is? That's it.
Okay, yes, of course. So Indian country is both a historical term of art and a legal category, one that's defined by statute. And so Indian country is, it consists of areas in the United States that are governed by native nations. Many of these 574 federally recognized and further state and other recognized tribal governments govern land masses that are larger than several states. And that colloquially and legally and formally is known as Indian country. Those boundaries are drawn by treaty, executive order, and other forms of formal law that are written and codified into the laws of the United States.
As a descendant of a grandmother who was in here on the Trail of Tears, you used the term swept away, what my people might call genocide. But my question is we saw oftentimes the Indian school. Would the Indian school be an attempt solely as assimilation, or was there an effort for that to be a training ground for self-government in Europe?
Oh, goodness. So the boarding schools were implemented across a range of jurisdictions from the lower 48, tribes within the lower 48, Alaska, Hawaii, the Philippines, Liberia, and they had in different instantiations, different goals and different structures, especially as they were administered and governed in different ways. And they also changed shape once Native peoples were afforded the ability to control their own colonial infrastructure by taking over the boarding schools and running them as tribally run institutions. So definitely once that shift in administration towards a native-run form of colonial administration took over, did those schools start to angle towards self-determination as their focus rather than questions of assimilation. But I think your question really hits at a deeper conundrum, which is, what is assimilation and self-government to a nation state that sees self-government singularly and through a homogenized vision of what good government is? And so, in essence, they saw those two states of being assimilated and able to self-determine as completely coextensive. And so the aim was towards both.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can now.
Thanks. Thank you very much for another very stimulating discussion. You created a picture of a very smothering colonial administration in the nascent field of political science and elsewhere, and it's very persuasive and well documented and so on. But I'm wondering about the alternatives, like in your mind as you study this, and the ones that were being contested at the time. There's a very strong labor movement. There's an anti-imperialist league. Lots of famous people very active in the anti-imperialist league during the Spanish-American War and after. I know you had a picture of Louis Brandeis up there, who's not on. I mean, he's actually all over the place. He contradicts himself and so on. But I think for much of his career, he's dedicated to a more radically democratic vision. And there are of course people that are further on the fringes who are even further from that vision and testing it even more. And Jane Addams was one of the speakers that in the roster of speakers at the for St. Louis Convention. She's also championing self-determination and self-government, building immigrant communities in Chicago, building their own
Thank you so much.
community.
Oh, sorry.
How you view those conflicts and the emergence of this field in the framework of all those conflicts, why they lost or whether they lost.
So I'm not sure they lost. I think backing up a little bit to unpack your question, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to restate it. I know it was cutting in and out for the live feed, but I think to sum it up quickly, so there are forms of administration that are good and forms of administration that are bad, and there are just forms of administration that focus on governing others without representation and some that don't. And I don't mean to connect these two fields of inquiry as a form of moral condemnation, only empirical inquiry to better understand how these two forms of government and ideologies around government formed in communication with one another. And I think Louis Brandeis is a wonderful example of a mixture of what became a utopian anti-capitalist socialist vision that was also entrenched in forms of colonial administration. He actually planned the system of government for Alaska once it was opened as a territory in the 20th century, including ways that he would use citizenship to drive infrastructure, the ownership of the railroads, for instance, the ability to access natural resources towards a social distribution of what he saw as public goods. But of course, that framework overlooked the Alaska Native population that were resisting those colonial frameworks at the time, weren't extended citizenship under the Constitution, and so thus couldn't even operate their own livelihood to ferry miners across the Alaskan landscape before they finally had to fight against that utopian framework for some form of self-determination that they operate under today under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And so those forms of government, I don't at all mean to say that one is good and one is bad or that we should throw them out. It more so is we should understand the complexities of them, their interwoven nature, and potentially the limitations in developing visions of idealistic and utopian technocratic government without constitutional or other forms of political or representative or accountability limits on those forms of government, that they maybe have been overlooked. And that watching those fields of government and ideologies develop in this context isn't a way to morally condemn them. I don't use the word colonialism because it's a moral condemnation. I use it because it's theoretically and empirically accurate. I have no other word looking at all these literatures, but I use it just to describe the mechanisms that they're dealing with and the empirical history that we're living with today.
Thank you so much for your talk. I find it very validating. As one, a student of international relations, I have my master's degree in political science and my PhD is in public policy administration, all fields that, and I was at an institution, I am an Indigenous person, and I never, ever wanted to study American politics because Indigenous people are not there, period. And I found my way through it, but all three of those fields have erased Indigenous people, even through a colonial or settler colonial lens. And so I guess my question, I found a way to navigate that through Canadian scholarship. I feel like they've done a much better job of theorizing and bridging these gaps. But I find myself currently with R&Rs in American political science that I'm having to justify my use of, I use using the settler-colonial relationship as the discursive ways in which Indigenous people can articulate their relationship to federalism and American federalism. So I guess my question is, like, what is your advice for Indigenous students to navigate and to uplift their people in American political science or legal scholarship, because there too, we're missing there too, or we have to use domestic dependent, that's unsatisfying to the Indigenous experience.
No, thank you. Trying to restate that quickly, I think it's again hard. I think I'll start with the easier earlier question, which is looking at these erasures within the discipline. What is the takeaway? And I think the relationship of these erasures to the visibility of Native people within the academy and theorization within Canada and other jurisdictions like Australia and New Zealand, where they better embrace and understand and theorize these things. And so I think what this literature, what this history offers, hopefully to the field of political science that will understand your approach to the discipline in greater depth once their own history is revealed to themselves, is a broader and more flexible toolkit than settler colonial theory, which focuses on settlement rather than colonialism as a broader. So it's sort of like I mean, it's a very inappropriate joke with my students, but the existence of flush toilets, we just don't need that word anymore. We don't need the modifier. They're just toilets now. And so here we have colonialism, and what we have over Puerto Rico isn't settler colonialism, or there are forms of it that are settler colonialism, but it's also just colonialism. And those frameworks don't exist in the past with expansion and invasion. They exist now. And this language allows the discussion of the colonial framework and colonial government to understand the ways that the U.S., not in the past, even in its acquisition of Louisiana and its invasion and government of Louisiana and the Louisiana Territory, but today, through its monitoring, through delegated administrative government, the lawmaking and governance and the elections of all of these colonies that operate under the federal framework of the US without their consent, without their meaningful consent. It is a complex relationship, and it is not as violent as it was in the past. There have been measures that have mitigated the most violent forms of American colonialism. I'd offer those as a lesson rather than as a reason to take this category out of the colonial frame. Because the US still, again, even with affording forms of self-determination, it colonizes and runs these governments. And that there are intricate legal and governing institutions here to study. And I wouldn't hide them or treat them as sui generis. They look like all of the other colonial governing frameworks that have been implemented for hundreds of years. There was a science to this. There's a pattern to this. And we need to unpack that just as much as we need to, and we're liberated by settler colonial theory as another form of colonialism to descriptively understand the way these mechanisms operated during expansion in North America, in Australia, and New Zealand, for example. Oh, what to offer Native students? I really just stick with it. It's a very, very difficult, it's essentially, running into erasures every day, but I think we have to live in that space. So we might as well make something of it.
Thank you very much for the background of the American political science field that you provided. I guess my question is an extension of the answer you just provided. So I'm an African from Angola.
Okay.
And I would like to ask a follow-up question based on her question. So how would you say that U.S. political practice today differ from Berger's original vision of American almost moral responsibility to colonize and civilize the uncivilized nations, and also looking at the American interest in democratization, toppling elected governments around the world? So how would you say it has changed over time? And what would you advise an African student trying to affirm themselves in the US by telling their home country's stories and political practices here?
I think most international students coming to the United States, by contrast to many and most other European or Commonwealth countries, are probably quite jarred by the problematic erasure of colonialism within the United States. Most other nations have better started to at least tussle with their colonial past, if not their colonial present. And those areas of inquiry are better established elsewhere than here. What would I offer in that? I think, again, studying those structures of government empirically, rigorously, comparatively, historically, looking at legal frameworks, actually getting knee-deep in comparing them. Not with a theory that will blanketly pull jurisdictions together, but by literally going archive to archive, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and saying these are the same people, these are the same institutions, and they're operating all over the place in the exact same ways. And guess what? They're actually turning it into a science and developing normative and theoretical conclusions. And that might give you, as it gave me, a language and a structure, and even just a recognition of the structures of government and legal frameworks that I saw. And so that is the beginning of a language. There is a broader study of both soft and non-soft hard forms of imperialism versus colonialism. These are not new topics, especially in the field of history. And those literatures are there. But I do think that this area of study is something that's important to look at, in large part because of the ways that the resistance of colonized peoples have actually reshaped these legal frameworks within the US. The US system around indigenous government is colonial, but it is also has forms of self-determination not seen anywhere else in the world. And that is not because the US is benign, it's because Native people have leveraged every single tool in front of them, legal, political, and otherwise, to reshape those constitutional frameworks to make them self-determinative. There are lessons there, especially when we're growing concerned about technocratic executive power that's not limited by the Constitution. There may be lessons in those forms of resistance that have been ongoing exactly with those forms of government for the last 250 years. So I'd offer that. I'm not a great comforter these days. It's a tough time to offer comfort, especially to students and anyone in the academy. But I do think, at least for me, this discovery, this history, this discipline offered a measure of theoretical and empirical structure to something that had felt amorphous to me for a very long time.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.